Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of MartechBrain, a Netcore initiative where we talk to the best brains in marketing, especially marketing technology, and delve deeper to understand one key idea in depth. Today, we have Ajay Row with us. Ajay is often known in the industry as Mr. Loyalty. He's essentially been in the loyalty space for the last 30 plus years. Worked with various organizations, including the Taj Group, set up the loyalty programs for them, ITC also, and been an entrepreneur, set up Litmus World, was one of the founders at Customer Asset. It's a great pleasure to have Ajay with us. Welcome to MartechBrain, Ajay.
Thanks so much, Rajesh. It's really a pleasure to be here.
And our theme for today, almost like that BBC Mastermind, it reminds me, the theme that you have chosen today to be grilled on is, of course, the world of customer loyalty. And when we were chatting, you brought in the analogy with Gödel, Escher, Bach. So Gödel, Escher, Bach on one side, data-driven marketing, CRM, loyalty on the other side. Explain the connection, Ajay.
Okay, so my thinking is, let's talk about what Gödel, Escher, and Bach is really about. It's really about two things, right? The first thing is building up consciousness from the most basic level, right? And the second thing is about strange loops. And strange loops are what, in a way, destroy a system because it just can't exist within the system. For example, Gödel's, theorem, all those are reasons why a system should not work the way it does, but it does, right? So let's talk a bit about that and start from there. So let's start with the human being, right? No, let's not start with the human being. Let's start with the protozoa. Every living being is driven by incentives, right? Every living being exists to be driven by incentives. Every living being faces constraints, right? I mean, there's sort of limitations to what the being can do. And typically, because of constraints, they're trade-offs. So, you've got a trade-off. Do I procreate or do I run like hell from the lion, right? There's always a trade-off which you're making. And the last thing is, as we move higher up the chain, it's perhaps not as important, though it is important even at the insect level when you think about bees, is relationships, right? Starting with ants and bees and moving on, I think we're completely dependent as living beings on relationships. So let's start with those three fundamental things, right? Incentives, constraints, relationships. And now let's apply that to marketing as a whole. And of course, loyalty, CRM, data-driven marketing, all these are parts of that whole. So what is marketing really about? When you think about it, the first thing you do in a marketing situation is, you don't have an infinite budget, you've got a limited budget. You've got some target to it. So you've got, all kinds of constraints under which you're functioning. You therefore identify a target audience. And we are smart in your identification of the target audience. You identify a reason why they want to do business with you, right? Why they want to buy your product. Okay. So now that you've identified your target audience and you've identified the reasons why to buy, you then go out and create an advertising campaign, you take care of your distribution, you make sure your product can actually deliver, and all the good stuff that all marketers do, right? So fundamentally, you ask three questions. Who's valuable to me? What's valuable to him or her? And how do I deliver value and hence extract value over time? Right? So in effect, what has happened is when we go back to our three basic principles, driven by incentives. Your incentive is who's valuable to me. That person's incentive is because you're valuable to them. You're working within constraints. So you need to figure out how to deliver the value, and you can't deliver everything. So you're going to pick things which you're going to deliver. You follow where I'm coming from. So starting from the basics of life, you come to the basics of marketing. Now, CRM really is nothing but the basics of marketing. Who's valuable to me? What's valuable to him or her? And how do I deliver and extract value? Now, what's the difference between CRM and general marketing? See, in the old days, FMCG companies, right, and companies with that kind of business makeup had a very simple formula. Market share is equal to profit share. The thinking is basically there's so much profit to be made in a business. The greater my market share, the more my profit. Why is that the case? Because as an FMCG company, CPG company, whatever you want to call them, the more I sell, the cheaper it is to make an individual unit of product. The cheaper it is to distribute it. The more power I have with the retailer, the better my advertising can be, and the more my advertising can be, and therefore my brand pull is greater, etc., etc., etc. So the more I sell, the more profit I make. Okay. Now with CRM, that changes because the types of companies we're talking about are different. Market share does not equal to profit share. As we think about things like, for example, your favorite subject, velvet rope marketing, and we figure out where the profit lies in the customer database, you'll figure that a percentage of the customer database gives you disproportionate profit. If you can increase your share of that percentage using data to do so, things change dramatically, right? And that's really where the CRM plays, where we have the data. Now, it could be argued that with the new tech, like the martech and the ad tech, we're getting a lot of data even in FMCG companies. And a lot of them, if you think of digital type things like QR codes and so on, a lot of them are building the data very aggressively. And that's really a good thing. Incidentally, in FMCG companies, when I used to work with EMEA, which is the world's largest loyalty company at the time, and used to handle Nectar, which has about 7 or 9% of the UK's economy flowing through it. Somebody told me a very interesting thing. The high individual purchases of Coke, right? Individuals, these are households, buy 60 liters a week. So even in FMCG companies, at least FMCG companies like Coke, there is that profit sort of difference, right? What they do with 60 liters of Coke a week, I don't know. Presumably they bathe in it or something, but that's a different story. So let's back up to where we were. But let's stick with the CRM companies for now, because that's where we want, and we call those companies typically top box companies or left box, down box. And it's okay. If you draw a continuum, on this axis you have ticket value, and on this axis you have frequency of repurchase. Anybody who's got a high ticket value, high average purchase, and high frequency of repurchase is somebody who's going to have a very highly valuable customer relationship, right? Because there'll be a big difference between the guy who buys once and the guy who buys 100 times, right? The amount of profitability, because the amount of acquisition cost in getting the guy buying 100 times is ironed out across 100 instances. For the guy who buys only once, you're ironing it out again. So the profitability right there becomes far more. There are many other ways in which profitability increases. So what happens with CRM is you now have the ability to play that game to select who you want to start targeting and what is valuable to them, right? So when you go back to that, who's valuable to us, we're looking obviously at profit share, that's to start with, but we're also looking at other things, like for example, retention value. Because if you're fickle, you may give you a lot of money, but you're fickle and you're going to disappear. I mean, that's great and all for that one time you're there, but you're not going to disappear. You're not as valuable to somebody who just stays the course, right? And so therefore, going back to our 3 questions, we start understanding who's valuable to us based on various constraints that we have on how we want to run our business, right? Once we've got that, we then have an opportunity to figure out what's value to them. And bit by bit, we can add that value to them, therefore building loyalty, right? And, it takes a fair amount of thought to figure this out. But I think, our job as marketers and as CRM experts is to do just that thing, okay? So now going back to the Godel, Escher, and Bach. So what's the difference between CRM, loyalty, and data-driven marketing? And the reason why, if you recall in your email, I told you I'm a badger rather than a fox. I don't know a lot about I don't know little about many things. I do know a fair amount about these one thing, which is CRM, loyalty, and data-driven marketing. I'll just explain. Loyalty is just a way by which you enable CRM. There are places where you need a loyalty program because there's no other way of knowing an individual. For example, retailer, right? An airline, hospitality. Since I can't identify which butt is on which street without a seat, without a program, a loyalty program, as an airline, I'm disadvantaged. When I launch a loyalty program as an airline, it could well outlast the airline, as our friend Manish Dureja has done, right? I mean, that's the power of the loyalty program. Instantly, the bulk of loyalty in programs in airlines make more money than the airline themselves. And there are many interesting stories about how Ash Gupta took a decision to keep Delta alive because of the number of points on American Express cards, right? And it's fascinating. We can go on and on about these stories.
In fact, very recently, during the pandemic, I think both United and American Airlines have raised money on the strength of their loyalty programs.
Which makes complete sense. I didn't know that, and I should have, but that's absolutely.
They've raised a few $1 billion, I think, and probably the value of the loyalty programs may be more than even the value of the airline, I think, in some of these cases.
And why does the loyalty program have such value, you may ask?
Yes.
Right? It's because of its ability to do effective database marketing. See, with the loyalty program, you know who you're talking to, you know where he's coming from. And we're talking about the advantage, the program which your wife is a member of, the Apparel program. They have all the data. If they're not leveraging it, shame on them. I'm not mentioning them, but you understand what I'm talking about.
Correct.
Is that if you don't use your data when you have it, right? Shame on you. Because you went through all that effort and expense, and the person made an effort to give it to you. I mean, it's not easy for me to give data to a company. If I made the effort of giving it, you should accept that with gratitude and then utilize it, because that's why I gave it to you, for you to use it. Which is why it annoys the heck out of me that every time I interact with my bank or almost anything of significance, they want to do another KYC. Right? And I've been banking with them the last 25 years, guys. I mean, you really want to know? I haven't changed my home address. Nothing has changed here. Why do you need a KYC again? But apparently they do. I spoke to my cousin who was then the deputy governor of the RBI and said, what the hell, you guys caused the banks to do this? He said, rubbish, we don't do anything of the sort. This is entirely the banks doing because they're paranoid, because they don't generally know their customers. So I think what happens with CRM is you get to know your customers, with loyalty, you become able to track them effectively because they have a means to do that. And with effective data-driven marketing, right? And I think the question in effective data-driven marketing is not what do I want to send the customer, right? Because that's easy. There are 500 things you want to tell the customer. It's what does the customer want to hear from me? I had a colleague who used to ask this question ruthlessly. And she drove our response rates, our open rates up at the company we were then with to 84%, right? And then to a stable 74% for years. And she consistently asked the question saying, why does this customer want to get this unit of information? Of course, we did some very cool, because we didn't have the tools in those days, so we used to use Excel to do personalization. Every mail was personalized to every single individual. So we had about 140, 150 versions of every mail. While I'm saying personalized to each individual name and all that was personalized, but the content also was personalized using these Excels behind it, right? Incidentally, Rajesh, nothing has changed, right? The same principles, when I had an 8,000 person database when I was an ITC, which is the first loyalty program, I think, outside of the US and the UK and Germany, right? And we kept that on a PC, literally a PC with floppy drives, right? And the database was kept on 24 floppy drives. One of the floppy drives went corrupt. Everything went fucked, right? So you can imagine how it used to be, right? I used to know those 8,000 names in my mind. They were literally here because in case the thing went corrupt, they'd come to a point with what we used to call the DM boys and myself, the direct marketing boys and myself, used to be able to recreate a corrupt floppy disk because though we had backups. So going from those days, nothing has changed. In those days, we coded our database. It was for the hospitality company. And we coded the database with the functional area in which somebody worked, the hierarchy level which he reached in his organization, and the industry in which he worked in. And we found those were darn good predictors of whether he'll use our hotels or not, and which hotels he would use. Right? Nothing has changed. Now we may have thousands of segmentation parameters, but the thinking is much the same. Right? We used to communicate using these units of information. And most of our job was around what we call swap outs. Don't send something to somebody who doesn't want to receive it. Because if you do that, A, you're wasting money, you're irritating him. And worst of all, you're educating him to ignore you. Because he ignored you, nothing happened, his life didn't change. Right? So now he's learned, I can ignore this guy. It's pretty easy, right? And he carries on ignoring you. And that's the biggest cost to your database, when you teach people to ignore you. So it's actually not so much the cost of the mailer, which today, let's call it, I don't know what Netcore charges, but I'm sure it's in paisa. It's not going to be, in hundreds of rupees like it was in the old days with direct marketing, a nice swank brochure and all that. But it's not that cost. It's the cost of teaching somebody to ignore you, which is the real trouble, right? As we go along and we realize that actually what we're doing now is we're using the database marketing so far as an email / snail mail media, right? But a lot of the time, your customers interact with you in real time. They also become a data-driven marketing medium. If you can give information to your customer at the moment of truth, at the point where the customer is interacting with your staff, and it can equip your staff to deal well with that, I think you're on an up and up, right? So that basically summarizes the Godel, SR, and Bach, data-driven marketing, CRM, and loyalty. Yeah,
it's a fantastic overview, Ajay. So if I were to just build on what you said, so the starting point, of course, is the customer driven by incentives, constraints, and the relationships which are there. The customer is, in a way, every action of the customer or inaction is giving data back to the brand.
absolutely.
It is the brand's responsibility how to use that to then build the relationship. The customer wants that relationship. The customer is saying, tell me what I should do next, make my relationship with you more relevant. And that's where the data is being given. And now the brand has basically got all of this data. They have to now decide what is the next best action that they should be taking or they want the customer to take. And this is really the foundation of the data relationship that we are talking about. Is that a good way to sort of capture what you've said?
Yes, it is. Let me just spend a moment on data, if I may.
Yes.
Right? I think people, let me be honest, I'm in violent agreement with one of your previous interviewees who said people don't get data. Right? And I think, and I'm going to tell you later that one of my greatest disappointments is that despite doing my level best, I've not been able to get people to get data. Right? And I've tried very hard. So, but I'm going to try again.
Yes.
I'm an old man now, and the only thing I can do is pass the learning on and hope like somebody picks it up here. So let's go through the types of data. The first type of data, let's call it profile data. I make an effort to tell you, Mr. Brand, about myself. I fill in your form. Now, the reason why we make those forms long and complex is two reasons. One is we want somebody to make an effort to become a part of our loyalty program, right? The second reason is because we want to get data that you can use effectively to improve your life. Now, I hate loyalty programs which say things like, tell me what your interests are. And they have all these little boxes saying fishing, hunting, whatever. And how are you going to help the guy's life, man? You're a soap brand here. Why are you asking that? It's not helping you in any manner, right? But if I use stuff which helps me, now, for example, let's say I'm a hospitality brand, and I found out that you want a hard bed or a soft bed. My brother is a very competent creative guy, and he wrote a line for us many years ago in the hospitality thing, saying that the minutes you spend here will make the hours you spend at our hotels more comfortable, right? If you tell me you want a hard or a soft bed, right, and I can consistently give that to you, it makes a difference to your life, right? If you can tell me you want a high floor or low floor. For example, I like a high floor because I like the view. You may say, no, I'm scared of fire. I want to be on the first floor, right? Somebody else wants to be near the elevator. Somebody else wants to be far from the elevator. Near the elevator, because in case there's a problem, I can get out real fast. I can hear voices in the night. I feel reassured. Somebody like me wants to be far from the elevator because I don't mind the walk, but I really don't want to get disturbed through at 3 o'clock in the morning because somebody doesn't have the manners to keep the voice down, So as you go through and you start filling in these units of data, which have high predictive value from a loyalty program perspective, right? So we're talking about profile data first. The second type of data you get is transaction data. Because I've now given you a unique number, I can attach that unique number to all your transactions. And there's a lot of insight which I can get from the transaction, right? I get the time, I get where it was done. So now that I know where and when, I probably know why, or at least I can make an educated guess at why. I may even be able to make an educated guess about how, right? So if you think of the 5 W's and the H questions, you can see how you're beginning to populate it between profile and transaction data. The third kind of data you get is interaction data. I didn't transact with you, but I interact with you. I called your call center, I went to your website, I tried to make an order, it didn't come through, whatever. All these are ways by which I interact with you. I liked you on a social media, etc. Now, all those interactions can also be total. That's the third type of data. The fourth type of data, and we can carry on going, but I'm going to stop over here with the 3 main types. But the fourth type of data, which is perhaps the most, is what we call derived data, which is I total these types of data to get some incremental insight into you. So, for example, let's say you're somebody whose every transaction is in the top 5% of transaction value. So you make few transactions. You're not in the top 5% of transactors in terms of number of transactions, but every time you transact, it's in the top 5%. let's say I'm a restaurant. That gives me a lot of insight into you.
Absolutely.
Right? That's derived data. On the other hand, me, I go to the same restaurant. I go there very frequently. I go there 10 times a month. But every time I go, I spend 200 rupees here. I just have a cup of coffee and leave. Right? Now, the restaurant may be fond of me because they're familiar with me, but they should be far more fond of you because you're giving them so much more money. You're giving them 10,000 rupees, and giving them 200 bucks, and costing them the same amount of service and being, taking up their chair. They perhaps should be able to recognize that difference and start thinking about their derived data that way. Right? Now, as we get more sophisticated, so one way of looking at derived data is to say, look, let's just do it based on logic, which is this kind of logic which you went through, which is, common sense business. As we get more sophisticated, we can start building out, analytical algorithms because, we've got a very large database, we've got millions of records. No one can look at it. So let's start building out some, really cool algorithms. And we start populating the database with those algorithms, right? Now, the issue is, how do we use those algorithms? One of the favorite actions is, tell me the next best action. And what that next best action typically is, I'm not saying it's always this way, sometimes it's done far more intelligent, but typically, let's look at other people like you. When they bought what you last bought, what did they buy next? Let's suggest that to you, right? Now, if you think about that, is that really what you should be doing, right? Or should you be thinking as a marketer, putting on your, who's valuable to me, what's valuable to them, and saying, what's valuable to this individual, right? I remember when I took my first home loan, I went to an insurance company and said, will you sell me an insurance product? Because God forbid I die or something. My wife and kids should not be saddled with this massive loan, right? So I want to cover it. And can you give me a loan? Can you give me an insurance product which decreases as the loan gets paid off? And they said, no, we can't do that. Now, what should they have said? Yes, of course, they should have said, we'll do it and all that, but that's not the point. The point is they should have said, hey, look, some kind customer has come by and given us one heck of an idea here, right? They've done it now 20 years later, right? I'm told that they actually do such a product which the banks provide. The point I'm trying to make is that one of the other types of data that we get from the customers is ideas, is suggestions, is how they feel about us, right? And that is something which you can use very effectively. Sorry, I did promise you I'll stop after the interaction data. There's a category of interaction data, but it's a category which is particularly powerful.
I think this is very helpful, Ajay, because there's a lot of, everyone talks about data without really understanding, I think, what types of data there are and how do you use it, right? Now, one question here is that, see, what you've described actually is sort of marketing 101 in some ways. That
yes.
Segmentation, targeting, focus on what the customer wants, the necessity really for a loyalty program. And yet you find very few companies actually get it right. So what are the barriers to actually building a good loyalty program, which in turn results in a very good customer relationship, which in turn results in profits? So this seems logical, and yet very few of them actually do it. Why is that?
So I've got a business partner in one of the companies which I've done, who used to say the problem that we have is brand managers no longer want to become the marketing director of the company in which they work. His point was, if you took a company like Levers, right, the guys who are brand managers would look forward to being there for a very long time and would take it all the way, and they would be concerned about the brand. His point was that too many companies now, you're looking quarter to quarter and you're evaluating a brand manager quarter to quarter. And what is happening as a result, that he is just looking at how can I get a damn good result in this quarter and then find my next best job, right? So for him, the next best action is how do I get my next best job, which means I need to show phenomenal quarterly results. Whereas when if you took companies like ITC, Levers, the traditional wholesale companies, everybody is there almost for life. My dad, for example, was at Levers for 32 years or something like that, 33 years, and most people in ITC, most of my contemporaries from ITC are still in ITC, and with that kind of viewpoint, you look more in terms of, see, this brand is going to last with me for the next 30 years of my career. How am I thinking about it? So that's problem one, which is the viewpoint has moved from short-term to long-term. Now, that problem is a more endemic problem. So one problem is because people's careers are changing, but it's a more endemic problem because CEO downwards, everybody's driven by some 26-year-old who's going to ask hard questions on the analyst call, right? Which means that quarterly matters, unfortunately, right? So the ability to take a long-term view and do what is right is sometimes sacrificed in some companies, maybe not all, for, let's hit the quarterly numbers we got a database, just use the bloody thing. It doesn't matter if we can't use the Netcore to just hammer it today, get all the data you can, and let's not be all this cautious and, teaching people to ignore us and all that. Forget it. We'll worry about an export. Right now, do whatever you can. Right? And that, unfortunately, is the reality of many companies. So that's one. Two is, I think, marketeers, and I'm really thinking the guys born in the 70s, as your interviewee had said, are in an advantage position. I'll tell you why. One part is, of course, because India will take care of it, which is true. But there's a more important reason why. See, when I started working, there were no computers, right? I was given a computer, which I had to indent for in order to run a direct marketing program after about 6 months, right? And then when I got the first PC 8246 in that part of the company, people actually came and took pictures, and the finance department, was typically the guys who got the computers first, was jealous and very upset. So, why did this guy get the computer? But don't you get it? You need this tool in order to do the kind of stuff. They had the advantage in the early 80s, mid 80s of the computer revolution. So yes, they had the advantage by the time 91 came by of the opening of the economy, but they also had the advantage of being computer literate from day one, right? For me, writing code didn't start with structured languages. It started with numbered, languages, which is, a completely different thing. So once you get into structured languages, you get to learn how to do it. And then later with GUI interfaces, the ability to run comps is much less scary. Now that those guys are getting senior, you're getting people in organizations that actually begin to understand data. But previously, what we understood as data was monthly reports. So it was backward looking, very difficult to do any cross tabs. It was really, that was what we understood as data. We didn't understand an individual customer level. Right? Now, the sad thing is that if we don't demand this of the guys or the kids now, the guys are called between 23 and 30 now, and we don't demand that they begin to understand data effectively, we're not going to get a generation of managers who understands data by the time they get to points of seniority. Right? So I think that's really the thinking that I have on why this has not happened. So part of it is, of course, institutional, industry-wide. Part of it is individual-driven. And part of it is just the reality of how things have worked. Also, there's one more thing. Sorry, Rajesh, I'm taking a long time in answering this, but it's something that is close to my heart. As you can see, we did not have the background of direct marketing that they had in the US and the UK. See, the US economy was built greatly on catalog and direct marketing. Because in the old days of the Wild West, there were no stores. So, the catalogs which were provided by the then, Sears Roebuck and the giants at that time, provided the only way in which people could buy, right? So therefore, an institution of direct marketing was built over, let's call it, 75 years, 100 years, long before the internet came, right? And people like Lester Wunderman, we'll talk about him in a minute later, Peter Fader, the book that you recommended I read, The Gentleman Who You've Met, he mentions Wunderman, I think, in the first few pages of his book. And he points out that there's almost nothing in marketing today which Wunderman had not already given us, a sense of back in the 60s and the 70s, right? And the reason why Wunderman could do that, aside from the fact that he was a genius and, my hero, but aside from that, was because he had this background in direct marketing and all the learning which had happened for the 50, 60 years before, I'll give you an example. Have you heard of a guy called Albert Lasker and an agency called Lauren Thomas? It was the largest advertising agency in the world till the Second World War. It's now called Foot Cone Belting. But when Albert Lasker ran it, it was the largest agency. He joined it at the age of 14 in the mailroom. By the age of 17, he was a director on the board. By the age of 21, he owned it. Right? And when he was about 22 or 23, a gentleman sent a message up to his room saying, you run the world's largest advertising agency, but you don't know what advertising is. I can tell you in just 3 words, right? And Lasker said, okay, 3 words, I'll go down. He goes down and he meets this, Mountie, a 6'4" guy called John E. Kennedy, not to be confused with John F. Kennedy, but John E. Kennedy, who says advertising is salesmanship in print. And the 3 words, salesmanship in print, transformed what we do for a living. And out of that was born the catalogs, out of that was born advertising the way we now understand it. And that's what we're still doing. If you think about what we're doing, is we're trying to identify needs and sell effectively, right? Nowadays, our print is electronic, but it's effectively what we still do. So there's nothing new under the sun, is what I'm saying.
No, it's fascinating because I think what you're really bringing out is that it's very important to understand what has led us here, the entire history, because the fundamentals, the first principles don't change at all, ever. The media may change, print may be replaced by TV or the internet or app notifications or emails, whatever it is. But if you don't have a good understanding of the basics, I think you're not going to use the power of the whatever medium you're using to build those effective customer relationships.
You remember we spoke about strange loops?
Yes, right in the beginning.
Right. So let's talk about strange loops in marketing now, right?
Done.
And I'm going to say something which you may want to cut out of this later, but just bear with me. I think it's true. And I think it must be said, right? So I am a big martech ad tech company, right? And I say, let us implement a CDP to my client. Now, my client does a quick calculation. His boss, nowadays CDPs are the in thing. If I implement a CDP, that means another 10 lakhs to my annual salary. So let's implement a CDP, because then I can put in mind, it used to be, let's do a SAP implementation, I'll immediately get a raise.
Yes.
So an SAP implementation helped you some years ago. Now CDP implementation helps, martech implementations, ad tech implementation.
Yes.
So off they go to do a CDP, right? And then they build the CDP. And again, I'm going to refer to one of your previous interviewees. I was really blown by those two young men. They're really, really phenomenal. So they build the CDP and then they don't know what the hell to do with it yet, right? Because they didn't have the first principles in place, right? And I can take that and apply it across the board. Now, for example, I asked a colleague in a very, very large advertising agency system who was very dominant in the digital space, and there's a company which is considered very highly. And so I asked a colleague about A/B testing. And he said, yeah, we do A/B testing. I said, oh, great. Can you just show me some results? He said, no, that's with Google and Facebook here. So you don't do A/B testing, my friend. Google and Facebook do A/B testing, telling you how to spend more money with them here. When are you going to figure this out here? You follow what I'm getting at. People don't get it. There's a reason why you did A/B testing, was to build your knowledge. And you would know what worked and, more importantly, what didn't work, because then you could swap out, right? And that would give you better response rates. So it was, I think the problem is that we've now, one of the strange loops which causes a failing in the system is that implementing tech is equal to doing what I needed to do.
Correct.
When we used to build, in fact, we did it in partnership with your company, Netcore, many, many years ago, when we built what you today call a CDP or an MDP or whatever. And we used to call it the marketing database. And we brought in all these things and we created some predictive value and we built it from scratch. We knew exactly what we were trying to do and why we were doing it, because we actually, spent a fair amount of time. Now what you're doing is you're saying CDP has transformed company here, company there, company everywhere, respective companies, and I'll do it as well, right? And that's a strange loop right there, which is the system is eating itself, right? Because by an implementation, I believe I've achieved, but you haven't. You've achieved nothing because you haven't learned the basics really, right? And not that you've achieved nothing, that's unfair. But I mean, you could have achieved so much more. You follow where I'm coming from? And maybe this is iconoclastic and maybe I'm completely wrong. I'm just reacting to the few examples that I know. And I would hope so. But there's some people who seem to know what they're doing, right? Yeah. And they do a phenomenal job, right? But some people, perhaps not so much so.
No, very well put. I think having the end in mind, having the destination in mind is very critical. I mean, for many companies, basically implementing the technology, it becomes the end goal rather than the means to what they really want to achieve.
Correct.
So one question, as we sort of near the end, I want to dig a little bit into this is, you referred to Peter Fader earlier, and one of the books that he's written about on customer centricity, one of the ideas that he talks about extensively is the idea of customer lifetime value. So the sort of using the past transaction data to predict what the CLV is and using CLV as the metric for doing the segmentation. So any views on that?
Well, I built my first, this is true, it sounds incredible, but it's absolutely true. I built my first CLVs back in 1988.
Wow.
Right? These were for classic cigarette smokers. Right? Now, there's a strange correlation there. The more you smoke, the less you smoke later. Right? So, because what happens is that either your doctor says stop or you die. right? Because you spoke too much, right? So it's kind of a curve which goes like that, and then boom down, and by about 45, 50, it starts falling very dramatically. Most people have to give up, right? Or something happens and they give up anyway, right? So we built this out, and we found that what it took to switch to classic was 2 cartons. So we hired some very nice-looking young women in short skirts, which in those days in India was, I know this is politically incorrect, we shouldn't talk that way, but in those days it was, perfectly acceptable. And we set about to give these 2 cartons using our hotel database to predict managers at the age of, let's say, 30, 35, who we believed would be respected. Because if I saw this carton of cigarettes on my boss's desk or on a colleague of my respected desk, the chances are that I'd start thinking about it as well. And that's how it was launched, right? And these 2 cartons, they were given in 2 turns. So the girl would come by and give you once, and then, a month or 2 later, come by and give you another one, were actually the foundation of what became, a very high value CLV exercise, right? Now, I've gone on to build CLVs across the world, right? And one of the most fascinating is a CLV that we did for a chain called Red Lobster. Are you familiar with Red Lobster in the US?
Yes.
Basically, you go and eat a big lobster swimming in butter, and it's red, right? And you get fat, and you have your, pretty large family with you, typically large both dimensionally and in terms of numbers, and you'd go there, right? We were looking at the data, and we found a very interesting statistic. There are a bunch of single tables who would have only salads, right? Particularly in the evening. And so we figured that out, that what was happening was, let's see, if you're a single woman and you want to grab dinner, you don't feel like going home and cooking, where's the safe place to go?
Because there are families.
A place where people are with their families. Because in case that man looks at you sideways, he'll get one smack from his wife, right? Absolutely. And that will sort him out. So you're perfectly safe and secure. So granted that, knowing what the CLV is, what would you do? What we did was raise the price of salads, because you're not buying the salad, you're buying the security. Security is worth something. And that translated to quite an increase in the profitability, if not the actual revenue, of these single ladies, eating salads. Right? I can go on and on about this, the CLV calculations. We've done them in hospitality, we've done them in banks, we've done them all over the world. And I think when you start working on it, it gives you a very long-term view, which is why you get a little upset when people are looking at only quarterly views, saying that, look, you have the data, guys. You can build this out. And look, you can build it out we've done it with regressions, we've done it very complex, or you can do it very simply. I just say that, look, I expect him to get this much more money over so many years, and I'll discount the future things by some NPV value. So that's it. You don't need to, make it a mind-numbing exercise. I mean, God has not blessed me with a hell of a lot of brains. So, I try and do what I can. And you have Excel functions which can build out a CLV. Why would you do anything else? At least you get something. And getting something, and yes, of course, we can get more and more sophisticated. And as you get more sophisticated, I think you're moving more into the greed territory rather than the need territory, right? Where you want to go after every last rupee rather than, just saying, mota, this is what makes sense, right? And yes, we can get, but let's at least start with something, because it gives you that insight into CLV, right? And that's incredibly helpful because you know who to treat how. Incidentally, another strange loop is CLV versus day revenues. If you take business like hospitality and airlines, they're immensely perishable. A seat not sold on today's flight cannot be sold ever again, right? Okay, so immensely. So they have something called revenue management, which is to maximize the rate per flight. Okay, so now who would you give this ticket to? Somebody whose CLV is high, or somebody who's paying you more for this flight? Another strange loop, right? And this is a constant battle which I'd have with the revenue management guys wherever I was running CRM. Saying, hey guys, I mean, you have to give it to the guy because he's worth so much more over a lifetime. That guy's, it's a one-off. It's a one-off, right? I mean, he's going to come and he's going to go. It's not valuable. Whereas this guy's coming again and again and again. You've got to give it to him, even if you're going to lose money on this one flight. As I said, marketing is full of these strange loops.
Yep.
I think good lecture and buck is a good analogy for us to return to in marketing. It can be built from basic principles, create a system, and then find strange loops within the system.
Yeah. So one sort of final question on this one. I think if you were giving advice to the CEO of a company, what is the one metric that you think every CEO should track to see how well their marketing head is really building the future of the business, the long-term future of the business? there one metric which you would suggest?
Can I give you two metrics which are mirror images of each other?
Yes.
Right. One is, what is the brand value of your brands? Right. So what is your brand equity and how are you measuring that? Right. The second is, what is your customer equity and how are you measuring that? They're mirror images because the sum of customer equity is actually equal to brand equity, if you think about it. Right. I mean, not exactly, but more or less. Right.
Explain a little bit more. How do you measure each of these?
So let's say you add up your customer NPVs. Right. The sum of customer NPVs is equal to your customer equity.
Got it.
Right. Now, brand equity is slightly more than customer equity typically, because what happens with the brand equity is that you have three things, right? Let's think of a brand. I've got a friend, Ramesh Thomas, who's I think one of the most knowledgeable guys about brands that I know, who talks of what he calls the restaurant model, where you have the restaurant itself, the physical restaurant, you have the recipe, and you have the reputation, right? And these three together make the restaurant brand. The recipe is how they make the food, how they serve the food, what makes them special. The restaurant itself is the physical manifestation, which is what shows in your books. And the reputation, which is that ephemeral reason why you go there, right? You create something in your mind about that rest, is really where the value gets added, right? Now, typically, when you look at the books of the company, the physical assets are perhaps X, but the valuation of the company is perhaps 4 or 5X. What are people valuing? Now, you and I, from our experience of a particular kind of company, would say that what you're valuing is future free cash flow, right? And where does future free cash flow come from? It comes from customer equity and brand equity. So while I used to go around saying customer equity is the only thing that matters, right? I've now realized that brand equity is at least as important. So I'd say the brand equity and the customer equity together are what your head of marketing should be, tremendously. And how well are you making sure that happens? So what is your knowledge about that? Because it's not that I've got a customer equity of 1,000 crores and now I'm done. It's how good is your understanding to maintain that, grow it, etc. Because there's a knowledge base as well, right? Which is built into your customer equity. Otherwise, I'll discount you more because I don't believe you know what you're doing. You're depending on luck. Then your customer equity should be discounted more. Likewise with your brand equity. You may have built a fantastic brand by chance, but most people who know what they're doing, I think that is tremendously valuable, which is the knowledge. Sorry, I made it 3 years. Sorry about that.
Perfect, I think. As we near the end, I'm going to ask you what I call 5 ones. So quick answers. Get ready. Rapid fire. So one future trend tech /tech that excites you.
Phygital. I think physical meets digital is huge and it's going to change everything. It's not the Internet of Things. It's the Internet of people, with things, which is going to change.
Beautifully put.
All the way we know it.
One sort of trend or tech that has disappointed you.
Data and understanding thereof. We spoke about this earlier.
Yes,
I won't repeat myself.
One good book recommendation for people?
I get this a lot of thought. And I was thinking, the zillions books, behavioral economics, CRM, etc. But I'm going to go with my ex-boss's book, Being Direct, written by Lester Wunderman. I think it's a phenomenal book to learn the basics. And it teaches you by telling you stories. And all of us react well to stories. And he tells a story which establishes something with every chapter. So it's well worth reading. If you haven't read it, I must buy your copy. It's really worth the read.
Perfect. I think I'll go with that. I've not read it, and it's one book I'm going to read right away.
Yeah, I think it's well worth it.
Yep. One good person podcast to follow.
I don't follow many, but the one whom I follow more religiously is a guy called James Clear, who teaches you how to think. And I think learning how to think is perhaps my father drilled this into our heads when we were kids, which is teach yourself how to think, because, thinking is one thing, but knowing how to think is at least as important. I think James Clear does a damn good job of it. But there are lots of others. I mean, you can fall down really, there's so many others. But James Clear, if I had to pick one.
And my last question, one key driving belief in your life.
That's a tough one. I think I've observed that you get what you really, really want. So you don't need to get too stressed because what you really, really want, but what you really, really want may surprise you as you get older, right? You find that, actually that's what I really wanted, because you start off life saying, I want to do this, but it changes. And I think what's key to achieve that is learning it. every day you need to learn, and every day you'll get closer to what you want, because what you learn will be basis what you really want. It will be basis something inside. So that, I think, for whatever it's worth, as a old man, I'm allowed to make these pontifications, but I think it makes a big difference that you learn what you really like.
And on that note, Ajay, it's been a fantastic conversation. We've probably gone a little over time, but what an amazing journey listening to you. I think for anyone out there, this MarTech Brain is basically a sort of tutorial into the basics. For me, I think, of course, started with Gödel, Escher, Bach, and that is a theme which has flowed sort of through. Especially the idea of strange loops. It's something which I think one should explore. But I think most important really is how the basics, what you pointed out, the basics don't change. I think what has changed in people are the time horizons. Okay, instead of that long-term thinking, which really makes you build those deep customer relationships, which make you ask the questions that you asked in the beginning. What's most valuable to the customers? What's of value? I think if we sort of change that time horizon to the quarter and to the shorter threshold, and thinking that the next best action really is my next best job, I don't think you are going to do customer relationships. You're not going to do customer loyalty right. So great takeaways from this conversation with Ajay. Thank you very much. Thank you for tuning in. And I'll have Ajay have the last word before I wrap it up.
Sorry, I just realized that, we've been talking about Gödel, Escher, and Bach. And a lot of people watching this may not know what the heck that is. So it's a fascinating book for people of Rajesh and my generation, yes, written by a guy called Douglas Hofstadter. In fact, all his books are fascinating. Metamagical Themas, Fluid Theory, all of them are worth reading. But Gödel, Escher, and Bach is life-defining, life-changing. And I think it's worth to read. Getting through it is not easy, but at least dipping into it from time to time, I think you'll find very rewarding. So that's the last one. Thank you so much, Rajesh. It's been a real pleasure. I'm sorry for going over the time. It's a subject I love, and so I keep waffling.
It's been the good thing about conversations on the internet is we have infinite time. We have the long view, and I think this is a conversation which is there for the ages, I think, for people. Thank you very much. That was MarTech Brain, a Netcore initiative, and do subscribe to us, get it on whichever podcast channels that you normally use. Thank you very much.